Lyles Carr, welcome to Partnering Leadership. It is such an absolute honor to have you on.
Mahan, thank you. I've got to tell you, though, knowing something of the people I'm sure that you've interviewed and included on these podcasts, it feels a little like one of those "what doesn't belong in this picture" moment. So I'm pretty humbled that you'd consider me in your group of leaders. Thank you.
You are a humble leadership, and I am super excited to share your leadership journey with the entire audience, Lyles. You have had an impact on so many people, including me. But let's take a little time to find out about you. Whereabouts did you grow up, and how did that impact the person you've become?
I grew up sort of in two places. I was born on the Eastern Shore of Maryland. My family been down there for a couple hundred years, and were watermen, really, and ran a boarding house. My great grandmother, and that was the summer. We were there every summer, and I sort of think of that as home. Sort of literally the barefoot boy, uh, crabbing, fishing, those kinds of things. But in the winter, from the time I was 7, I grew up in Palmer Park, and we were the first family into the second section of the 5 sections of Palmer Park. Um, uh, and I mean, I took music lessons on Minnesota Avenue, so that was pretty much the inner suburb back then. And so that was the boyhood. It's interesting though. I mean, as I got a little bit older, I went to junior high school at Kent Junior High. It's now a police substation, by the way. I used to sleigh ride on Wilson's Farm Hill, which is where they built FedEx Field. And interestingly, I only realized this after the fact, but I experienced white flight. Bowie came along in the early 60s, and it sucked all of the sort of middle class out of the inner suburbs. Um, I was bused. Wayne Curry and I would have gone to Bladensburg High School together had I not gone away to a prep school, and I did. I went away to Episcopal High School in Alexandria, third generation. Although, and I didn't think of myself as being in a privileged class, because candidly, I'm the first person, and since our family's been here, my clan, if you will, Scottish, has been here since 1668. I'm the first person to graduate from college. We were sort of the wrong side of the track almost, against what was then the Southern nobility, the boys, and it was all boys, not integrated, totally segregated school at the time. And so it was a different existence. But my experience in watching sort of the complexion, if you will, and that's not a white or black thing, but the overall complexion and sense of community changing in Palmer Park as that development happened, and that's come back to me and been with me.
So, Lyles, how did those days impact who you ended up becoming as a community leader?
Well, again, it made me, I think, somewhat colorblind. We didn't think about kids as white, black, Latino. I mean, we were all kids, and it was a mixed race and mixed socioeconomic community. Right now, I get to Episcopal, and we're talking Southern white boys, and that's vastly changed now. I mean, it's integrated, both boys and girls there, and it's terrifically evolved as a school. But back then wasn't. And I was a Midland student for about 2 years, and in my 3rd year, right after the football season, I just felt like I didn't fit, that I wasn't part of that culture, and I went home, to the local high school for a year, and candidly, it cost me a grade, because I'd already had American history, I'd already had geometry. The 4th English book was my 3rd English book. The advanced math book I'd already had, but I realized that I was missing something in terms of underpinning values. It was sort of what does it mean to be a gentleman in all the positive sense of that word, and what were those? And I went back. I hadn't thought I belonged. I felt like I don't want to. I'm missing something. I went back and candidly turned into a wholly different person. I was a three-sport letterman, captain of one of the teams. I was ranked high on the high list, the academic honor roll, and it was a changing experience as I realized that juxtaposition of those cultures and experiences, and I realized that the privilege that I had been given and then sort of re-embraced.
So now go ahead, Lyles.
Well, it's interesting because just to carry that on, I then went to University of Virginia. I was on my way to Princeton for the wrestling team, and I got rushed pretty hard by the then wrestling coach at Virginia that was trying to turn that program around, and they got me down there on a party weekend, and I was impressionable. Because I was coming from Episcopal, it's the Episcopal in Virginia is the high school, and UVA is the university. So you pipeline the high school to the university. I was a multi-sport letterman. I was recruited to wrestle and was a varsity wrestler my first year. And so I got rushed pretty hard. I mean, there were 33 fraternities back then, and probably still are at Virginia. And here I am. And all of my classmates had gone to St. Anthony's or St. Elmo's or Phi Gam, all of the sort of the houses with the white columns in the main square, so to speak. And it was sort of moving in that direction, except that my dorm counselor was Jewish. And out of respect for him, I accepted an invitation to go down to Phi Epsilon Pi, which was a very Northern Virginia, Northern liberal Jewish fraternity. It only had open rush for 2 years. But they were a real brotherhood. And candidly, at the end of the day, as I was leaning towards the wrestling fraternity, that was Phi Gam, I couldn't, I sort of reflected on the two, and one looked like a social and eating club, and the other looked like a real fellowship. After dinner, all the guys, the brothers, were getting ready to go on a dating together or to the library together, or they were sitting around the house playing gin. I became a pretty good gin player. But it was really a fraternity, man. I said, heck with the trappings and heck with what other people might have thought I should have done. This is where I'm going. And I've stayed very close to those guys ever since. But I think the two experiences, three experiences really, the reflection back on Palmer Park and the rapid change of that community, the getting to Episcopal feeling like I was the other side of the tracks, even though I was a varsity athlete, those kinds of things, and going back home, and then getting to Virginia and rushing and pledging Phi Ep as opposed to Phi Gam were, I think, pretty seminal, because it was really about the people, not the trappings, and an understanding of people in different walks of life coming from different perspectives, different cultures. It gave me a sensitivity to it, even though, particularly in terms of ethnicity, these were still pretty monochromatic places. But I think that was an underpinning that helped me to better understand.
And it's obvious that many of those values have stayed with you through your community involvement. But before we get to that, I'm just curious, how did you end up in executive recruiting, which you've spent most of your professional life doing?
Well, that's a quick story. I was at a young age, I was very lucky to get with an organization that did specialty restaurants. And I happened to be in the management team that I did an entrepreneurial route going out of college, but then I drifted into this leading specialty restaurant company. And I was fortunate to have gotten visible or the recognition for creating one of their very hot properties. And that moved me into consulting. And at the age of 25, 26, I was helping organizations create theme restaurants and nightclubs. This is in the 1974, 75 Studio 54 era. And yes, I did know those fellas, all around the country. We ended up putting the first discotheque into Austin, Texas, of all things. But that wasn't family friendly. And it really wasn't a way to go. I was driven. I was working 100 hours a week developing these properties. And I said, I'll give you back all my shares in the property, but I've got to get out of this. And my dad had gone to work for my now partners, Bill and Brian McCormick. He had founded or co-founded what was at one time the third largest stock brokerage house in the region, in the Washington area, and then ended up fighting it out with the SEC to a tie at the Supreme Court over things that they now insist. They believed in full financial disclosure, those kinds of things, and the SEC thought that was intrusive at the time. But he went broke in the process and had gone in to see Bill and Brian just looking for a job, and they pointed a desk and a phone and said, try it out. And he became one of their first big producers. And I wandered into the office one day and said, I just can't continue to have a family life and be in the hospitality world. And they said, well, you see that desk and that phone that's on it, and we'll give you a nominal draw against a commission. And that was 44 years ago. So that's how I got into it. It was just by happenstance, and my father saying, you can actually do this.
And that entire industry, executive recruiting, has changed drastically since you started in it, Lyles.
Absolutely. I mean, it's, and there were major executive search firms back then, but it was still the permanent placement business for the most part across the country. They were just evolving from applicant paid fees. The organization we went with initially was a franchise, the largest permanent placement organization in the country that was entirely employer paid. And our office was the leading office in the country out of 500 or 600 offices for 2 years running. But we realized that was a permanent placement agency, and we'd evolved into something else that was at the time called contingency search and has evolved since. And whether it's retained or contingent, it sort of doesn't matter. It's executive search, and we do a lot of both. And so in 1981, I guess, we spun out and became the McCormick Group. And I was one of the account executives, and over time was successful. And somewhere along the way, Bill and Brian said, we ought to be partners, and here we are.
And Lyles, you have been successful both at executive recruiting, and you have been superbly successful in terms of your community involvement and activities. I'm going to link to your bio in the show notes, the 15 plus apps, and partneringleadership.com. People can read more about your background. But it is absolutely incredible when I look at all the awards that you have won in the region, and even more important than the awards, whether it is president of Leadership Greater Washington, to president of Jubilee Support Alliance, to founding board member of so many organizations, from Workforce Organization for Regional Collaboration, Leadership Arlington, Act for Alexandria, Virginia Early Childhood. I think it would take the rest of the podcast for me to just list the many organizations you have helped found in the community, which is why I'm going to link to it for people to see it for themselves. The question I wonder, though, is what drives Lyles Carr, and what has driven Lyles Carr for all these years to contribute to the community through all these different means and organizations?
Well, I don't think it's so much being driven as followed, but to loop back, I think it starts with my parents. I mean, my father was very engaged in the community and in social causes, and endeavoring to help just individuals, and particularly young people of color, that he would try to help either individually or through organizations or groups. And my mother really underpinning values. And so they're instilling in me just basic values that are fundamental. They're sort of a foundation. Okay. But then, I mean, I'm a practicing Christian. And just a quick story. I mean, I'd been successful with us in the late 70s with the McCormick group in different specialty areas, and we consolidated. I did management for a bit, but then after we consolidated, I had an opportunity to go back into practice, so to speak, and take on a specialty, and I did. I started our law and government affairs group, and I was successful in the initial year, but in the following year, things weren't going well. I didn't think particularly successful at the office. That led to some financial issues. The home wasn't as good. I wasn't the husband I needed to be. And sitting at my desk in the office at about 10:30 one night, I looked up, and by the way, looking up is sort of a human affectation because God is all around us. But I looked up and said, I need help. And I meant it. And it wasn't a bargaining thing. It wasn't, I'll do this if you'll do that. I just said, I need help. And 3 weeks later, the largest transaction in the history of the company, I think literally fell in my lap. And from there, it just took off. And the financial picture got better. The home front got better. I hope I became a better husband. At least she's put up with me now for 42 years, and hopefully that's ongoing. And I said there, and I had believed before, but I need to follow. It's sort of, so what do you want me to do? And that sort of led to, I mean, I find myself in places where I seem to be able to make a difference. I can connect two dots. I can introduce the right person to the right place, or connect two organizations, or see a place that needs help. I mean, it's amazing. Dr. King said it's amazing how easy it is to see what needs to be done if our thoughts are first on others. And I really tried to think about others. What does this mean to the other person? Not what does it mean to me? And so, like I say, I find myself in these places where I can see some leverage. I can see the benefit to come from connecting those dots or connecting those people or organizations. And I don't believe I got there just by happenstance, right? So it's interesting. I sort of preach or teach to professionals to get involved in the community, but to be strategic about it. I mean, there are 9,600 nonprofits in the Washington region the last time I looked or saw a statistic, and almost all of them are worthwhile and would be worthwhile people getting involved with. But okay, if I've got two organizations working on the same issue and one can give me a professional return, it can give me something to my business, I can then reinvest that return. Whereas otherwise it's tough to continue. Well, and I believe that. I do think that people ought to look at these things strategically, even though they want to do good. But frankly, I never did that. I simply said, I mean, I simply said, what do you need me to do next? Or I simply tried to become aware of what was happening around me. And all of a sudden, because I was involved with the Virginia Early Childhood Foundation and know more than I ever wanted to know about early childhood, and because of my long engagement with Jubilee Housing, when Jubilee Jumpstart came along, which is a separate 501c3 that deals with early childhood, and they were evolving, and somebody to connect some dots and bring in the right sorts of board members. And I just coincidentally went to an event where Jubilee Housing was being honored, and talked to Jim Knight, the tremendous executive director of Jubilee Housing, about what they were doing in this early childhood thing. And some needs that they have. And I hadn't intended to go that evening, but all of a sudden there I was. And, it's sort of, so I'm really a follower. I don't think a leader. It's sort of, what do you need me to do next? Has been how I've been guided through these things.
Through what you call being a follower, Lyles, you have become one of the most well-connected people in this region.
Sure.
And for years, I talk about networking, and it's not who you know, it's who wants to know you. You're one of those people that everyone wants to get to know because you have been giving so much to so many people and so many organizations. So what I wonder, if you were to reflect back now as the successful both recruiter that you have been, business person that you've been, and most importantly, the tremendous impact you've had on the community, many organizations and many individuals. If you were to give advice to the younger version of Lyles, what advice would you give to that person?
Well, I think first, it's not about you, right? Nobody does these things on their own. You need a supportive community around you. And with me, it starts at home, my wife. I mean, Sarah manages a successful real estate career, has her own list of causes, watches over a sort of ever larger number of elderly individuals who somebody needs to care about, realizes that while I'm out there doing my professional or community thing, I'm going to be pretty much worthless around the house, and still gives me tremendous support and encouragement. And my partners, I mean, Bill and Brian, they've never really looked at me and said, shouldn't you be doing something else, right? It's never been whether what I do in the community has anything to do with business. And like I say, even though I preach to and teach, be more strategic, I haven't been. And yet it's sort of the grit on the water, and it sort of floats back to you. But they've been not just accepting, but encouraging of getting connected, and not just me, by the way, the company. I mean, we give people 6 days a year paid leave to volunteer, and try to encourage to do that. Our nonprofit group does a lot of work with preferred rate and pro bono services for nonprofits. It's just a way to give back. And so my colleagues support me, right? So I think that's first. Understand that it's not about you. Second, I think you need to look at that. You need role models or mentors. Mentors, if you can connect them, if they're there. You don't necessarily look at somebody and say, you're my mentor. I mean, Bob Linos, for instance, was somebody I looked up to. And for those who don't know, Bob basically zoned Bethesda, and was one of the real leaders in our community, gosh, for a heck of a long time. Not a lot of people know that. He put up a big chunk of money to help form Leadership Greater Washington. And I bet you can't find 3 people that know that at this point, because Bob really built a community largely out of the limelight, and that's the way he liked it. And in fact, he was trying to avoid it, I think. And over the years, Bob and I would occasionally have lunch, and no agenda. I just wanted to get to know him better to see how he was going about these things. Right. And he was terrific to share his knowledge and insights with me. Jim Rouse, as you know, was very instrumental in Jubilee housing. And the one award that I actually have on my shelf, I have no plaques, no awards, no trophies, is a small two-panel stained glass award, the James and Patty Rouse Award, with a saying from Isaiah about Jubilee on it, that I have. And I got it directly from Jim. He presented it that evening. And because this is a guy, I mean, as Jim on his deathbed was despondent because he felt like he hadn't done enough. they hadn't made a difference to the poor, particularly in the U.S. And so to have people like that you say, I that's somebody that I would want to emulate, right? So I think that, and I think the whole idea of service. I'm big on leading from behind. I'm not looking for recognition. Like I say, no plaques, no trophies. And I have been more than recognized. I mean, this interview is embarrassing, candidly. The fact that I would be ranked or put in the pool of the other people that you've interviewed, because I'm happiest with somebody else getting the credit. That old saw that it's amazing how much you can accomplish if nobody's concerned about who gets the credit. And so I used to say I was a little like BASF, that old BASF commercial. I don't make the carpet, I make the carpet better. And so how can I help? And then just sort of be lost in the dim memory of time or something, or the dim mist of time. And so I think not worrying about getting credit for it, just getting something done. Thinking about the impact you have on other people, right? It's the networking's classic. People often confuse networking and business development. They think networking is out there trying to promote yourself. It's not. Networking is, what can I do for you without thinking about what you might do for me. It's connecting without keeping score. And yes, professionals ought to go network in places where there's the potential for a return at some point, but not from that person you're talking to that night necessarily. And so it really has to start with, what can I do for them? What impact will it have on them? What impact will my decisions have on the people who it most affects, who probably have the least ability to respond or the least control? And we're seeing that in our society today. I mean, the focus on equity and inclusion is such a long time coming, and we're starting to see it, but it's still so difficult for a person of privilege. And let's face it, I'm a white male who got a quality education and has had success in business, and have not had the experience of people. And I can't, even with all the work we do at Leadership Washington and there's other kinds of things, it's still not the same. I can try to understand, but I can't feel it, right? So I think thinking first of the other people, and that to me is a leader. It's not about the leader, it's about the people who they're ostensibly leading.
And Lyles, one of the wonderful things about you is that I do a solo episode that I'm going to be releasing in a couple of weeks. That example is leadership. And there are a lot of leaders that talk about the right things, but they aren't living it. You are a true example of leadership, because the advice you're giving, for everyone that knows you, most especially someone like me that has known you for 20 plus years, it is how you live your life. And that by itself says a lot.
Well, and frankly, it's why in the end I've accepted the awards I've been given. It's frankly not because I'm looking for the award and not because I want to stand in front of people and have somebody applaud. It just, I don't handle embarrassment well, and I find that just excruciating. On the other hand, it gives me a platform to call other people to action, to encourage people to get engaged and get involved. And at the end of the day, that's why you do it. But like I say, once I come off of that dais or out from behind the podium, if there was a tangible award, a plaque or something, it goes in a box. And it's not going to be displayed, because it wasn't about me. It was, how can I use that opportunity, that soapbox, if you will, to encourage others to get engaged.
So, Lyles, being the wonderful leader that you are there any resources for leadership or any specific things that you recommend to people when people come to you and say, want to become a better leader, want to aspire to be more like you, Lyles? What advice do you give them?
The more like me is a hard part, but find find somebody that you think is living life the way that you want to live life. And if you perceive them as a leader, leading the way that you would want to lead and try to emulate them. And if you can get to know them, there's nothing wrong with just calling. And I did this with Bob Linnos and said, Bob, I just want to get to know you better. And no agenda. I just like to sit down and talk with you. So I think that's first. I think it's interesting. David Rubenstein has come out with a couple of books recently that are conversations with leaders that are awfully interesting to look at, and then writers who have done the biographies of our leaders since George Washington. But I think learning from that, the things Bob Rosen, for instance, has done on leadership and what make. So I think reading is important, and then I think, how do I experience this? Now, the leadership groups, Leadership Greater Washington, Leadership Arlington, Leadership Montgomery, we've got a number of them in this region. There are probably 500 across the country. And those are immersion things. Those are not just talking heads. That's how can we become experiential? How can you really try to understand if you haven't been there yourself? As it turns out, because of my background in Palmer Park and growing up, I have been closer to these things myself than some people might think. And involvement with people like Jubilee Housing, they're eye-opening. If you want an experience, go to the service on Sunday morning at Christ House, which is the convalescent home or convalescent center for homeless people, homeless men, really being referred by Columbia Road Health Clinic, and watch them and their faith. And it's frankly, it's invigorating. It's renewing. So I think that, and so I think getting involved with those kinds of groups, I think trying to connect with people who aren't like us, right? And trying to understand the whole diverse experience out there. Yes, things like meditation. I used to run, that was my form of meditation. There's something that gives you some alone time, and whether it's prayer, whether it's meditation, whether it's yoga, but I think that kind of thing is important. And frankly, like most people, I don't do it enough.
And I understand you have a poem that you use as inspiration for yourself.
You've heard about that. Yeah, it's whether it's a poem or prayer, it's an anonymous author, and I'll just say it's is anybody happier because you passed their way? Does anyone remember that you spoke to them today? Can you say tonight in parting, with the day that's slipping fast, that you helped a single person of the many that you passed? Is a single heart rejoicing over what you did or said? Does the one whose hopes were fading now with courage look ahead? Did you leave a trail of kindness or a scar of discontent? As you close your eyes in slumber, do you think that God will say, you've earned one more tomorrow by the work you did today? And that, if I've got a mantra, that's it.
That is absolutely magnificent, Lyles Carr, and it's evidenced by all the great work you've done in the entire community. On behalf of all the listeners of partneringleadership.com and on behalf of the entire community that is better off because of Lyles Carr, thank you very much for joining us on Partnering Leadership.
Well, you are overly kind, and I appreciate those, again, overly kind words, but thank you. I've enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you, Lyles.